hopefully, I'm going to, before we get started, I'm going to bring up the share screen and show you the 3 things that I have for handouts today. In your notice, I said that one of the handouts you had to go out to our site to actually get at a Great Falls Genealogy Society, because I believe it's about 40 pages long. It's all of the Montana newspapers that are available, and it's meant to be an example for you as you begin to curate your own list. That is, figure out what you want from various places, so you're not left saying, well, I have one newspaper, what's the next paper that I could go to, or whatever. So I'm going to go to the share screen, and I'm going to show you, first of all, the one that is available at our site. Can you see that? It's called Thomson's Montana Newspaper Finder. If you can see it, would you please, Suzanne M., hold your hand up with a thumb? Okay, fine. People can see that. This is my newspaper finder for Montana. I realize that we have the Montana Memory Project, and it does a pretty good job. I've found some others. I'm hoping you'll tell me some of the other things that you find, but we've been sharing this one for free out at our site for several years, and I update it once a year. It takes considerable time to do it because I go through and look at every one of them again. But this one is available, and the really neat thing about it is that it allows you to begin to look at these newspapers by place and county, the actual name of the newspaper, the dates available, the various different online sources where they are available, and then there might be notes. $, of course, notes that it's going to cost you dollars at that particular thing. Maybe it'll tell you that there's 8,902 issues of the Anaconda Standard at Genealogy Bank. So it does that particular thing, and it does it county by county. I'm just amazed all of the time to see that the number of places in Montana that are bringing their newspapers online, and I'm delighted by it. I hope you are too. You can find that out at our Great Falls Genealogy site for free online out at our site, and you're just going to look under resources. Pretty easy to find. So the next thing that I am going to show you is a sheet that you've got available that I've updated again on online newspaper sites, various places. Again, it's just a fast overview of each thing. LFind or LFind is just one of my favorite things to find with historical newspapers, and I'll show you why in a few minutes as we're going through. But these are tried and true. And one of the things that I like about them is these seem to be staying where they have been placed. And yes, I misspelled Genealogy Bank up here. I apologize for that. Catching myself in my errors. So there's that 2-pager. And then the one more is that what I'm going to be talking a great deal about today is making or curating your own newspaper research archive and the tools that you actually need to be able to do this. Your notes and your timeline for first of all, and your fan club. Being careful to identify newspapers from multiple locations. There might be 5 newspapers, for example, for Cascade, Montana. I know that personally that Cascade Courier was there. I know that the Argus in Lewistown sometimes carried columns from there. Of course, the 2 Great Falls papers did, and so did Helena newspapers. So you have to look at and think about newspapers from multiple locations. We're going to talk about that union list of newspapers that I've put out for you. It's online. It's also a really neat book that you might find in your local library. It's a big old brown book. I know I managed to get that copy of the old book from the people downstairs in our Great Falls Public Library. I like it because the Union List of Newspapers book and its online site both also show you the Canadian newspapers. And that's something that is not available at that big newspaper list that is at Chronicling America. So I really like that. You have to have a lot of tenacity, and you have to be really willing to go after your newspaper list and keep looking for things. There isn't any one best place for these. And you're going to have to be willing sometimes to actually, yes, use microfilm still, because of course, a lot of these papers have not been placed online, but the microfilm is available usually from a state historical society or from a presidential library. Of the presidential libraries, I think that the very best one covering the Middle West and a little bit of the West, but covering the Middle West and covering the East is the Lincoln Presidential Library, and they ship their stuff out for free. There is no charge. And make a file right on your desktop. Don't lose this in your other places. Keep that on your desktop. I'm going to show you some things that I've found. When we curate our own list, it means that we really think carefully about what we're going to do, because we're going to organize our list. We're going to maintain it, because every time you or I go out to look for a new newspaper and find it, we learn some itty bitty things. Sometimes it's a fact. Sometimes it's the number of ways in which newspapers change their names frequently, so that you realize that there might be 4 different newspapers as we have them in Great Falls for the Great Falls Tribune. Yes, they had a Great Falls Weekly at times. They had an evening newspaper at times. They had some very different things. So you need to look at and think of that, especially if you're in places like Helena. Helena, you have probably 15 newspapers or more to look at. They're in their list. You'll see that in this sheet, I've also given you that super list again, where you can go look for what I call my super sources. I really like Genealogy Bank. It's something that requires a subscription, but it has all kinds of government reports, and it also has things like the list and the papers potentially for anybody who invented something. So there are lots of things there and lots of things that they're gaining on all the time. Google News, if you haven't been out to it and looked at it, sometimes it's a little clunky, but you can look in there and you're going to see many good things. So this thing, I'm not going to go any further with it right now. I'm just going to whistle through this so that you can see what you might want to be doing, because you're going to dive down anyway, and you're just going to try to do one thing at a time. You need to remember that you're going to get the biggest dividends when you think big and you go after all the possible newspaper sources that there are. So take time to go out to that neat resource that I told you about in the first place here, that talks about being able to look at the original print source book for finding newspapers. It's online now. I find people don't use it nearly enough. I'm hoping you will. So I'm going to stop the share on this one. And now I'm going to go to the actual presentation. I did not do notes on these today. If you wait a couple of days and you want these, if somebody wants them, I know Jan Boyle frequently does, I'll have them done, and you can ask me via email for these particular notes. So without further ado, finding news about your family in historical newspapers. I'm going to cut to the chase, because I think that online newspaper sources are so awesome. They are giving us so much today that we really need to begin to use them as a major source for information about our families. I do recognize, of course, that not all newspapers are going to be available, not by a long shot. Some are still only available on microfilm, but you are going to be able to find them at State Historical Society sites, presidential libraries, local libraries. If you're stopping into a little place like Weeping Water, Nebraska, for example. They had those right on microfilm. They had one of 2 copies available in the state, and it sure was much appreciated. Many of these, again, have not been microfilmed. They haven't been scanned. They're only available locally. Sometimes you may have to find a local researcher if you cannot begin to get to some of those little newspapers. I guess this is the place to say right here that we have recently heard, and it's a well-founded rumor we've heard, that our other newspaper in Great Falls, the Great Falls Leader, is finally going to be fully microfilmed and will be available courtesy of the Montana Historical Society sometime in the next year or 2. So I'm very happy about that, because that was another main source, especially in our area of Montana, for all the gossip that was fit to print, and also for a lot of stories that were hyped on the street by newspaper boys as being really something that someone needed to read right away. That's how that newspaper was different from the Great Falls Tribune. I know that that both Butte and Helena had similar newspapers that looked a little more sensationalized at times, so look for those. But I think newspaper sources, it's one of the places I really want to go as I'm making my timelines. I strip the newspaper article and put it right in to my timeline, just in the timeline format, because I know that my family's going to want to read about it. So why not get it right there instead of secondhand? I want you to strategize to generate best search terms for yourself. Yes, we think in terms of the words we use today, the terminology we use today. And we have to begin to realize that some of that might not have been used and might not have even been described that way if we're looking back 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So you need to strategize to look for what terms might be best for the historical era. I'm going to tell you how I do this. I go in and I sample. I go into a newspaper. I look at what the terminology is, looking at Boston newspapers, for example, from the 1790s. I see very, very different terminology used with regard to those who were immigrating. I don't see the term immigration used right there. I see more of a ship's list or a ship's manifest. I don't see everyone listed, so I have to be strategic in the way in which I use the surnames I'm looking for and the ship names. And so that's what I mean by searching for terms that are going to be best for the historical era. You need to generate that list before you begin your search. I know, you just want to get started. I understand that. So you're going to add those search terms as you read. And I put a plus sign if I'm going to be using a lot of different search terms. On my little list, I put a plus sign beside the ones that really paid dividends for me. Why would I do that? Because 4 weeks from now, I might not remember, even if I look back at that list in my notebook to see what search terms I used. I might still be missing that one and saying, doggone, I really meant to write that one down. What was it again? And then I remember it sometimes in the middle of the night. Another thing that you can do is you can ask a librarian for useful search terms. Sometimes they're pretty good. Librarians in public libraries are very good with helping you with useful search terms, especially if you identify the historical era, and they can do a little bit of sampling of those pages too. For example, if you look at our public newspapers in the 1920s and the 1930s, and you're looking at crime, and you're looking at various pieces of crime and how they are described, one of the best things that you can do is go out and put in quotation marks, put in Federal Bureau of Investigation or FBI in quotation marks, just so you can begin to see the number of articles that come up about what they're using to describe crime, because that's mainly what got used then by newspaper people. So it's a very, very fine place to start. Also, you're going to come up with some really neat stories about criminals that the FBI has sent out information to local newspapers because they believe that that person might be in your area. And so what does a newspaper do? But they produce the print about that particular person, including the AKAs, or the also known as, or the aliases for that person, making it a very, very good thing for you. The other thing, if you're looking for search terms for criminals, for goodness sakes, in most states, they have something like our Montana Memory Project. You need to look out at the Montana Memory Project and put in a criminal's name that you found who came from Montana or was sentenced out of Montana into the prison, and look at the search terms that are used on their intake sheet. There are intake sheets that tell you all the names that they may have used, the crimes for which they are accused, because they repeat on those often. So it's well worth reading those to begin to generate your list of search terms if you're looking for that. If you're looking for things like wills, if you're looking for probates, knowing that you're going to be looking back in those probate records in the ads of the official newspaper for a particular area will send you searching for that particular newspaper that got the contract from the county commissioners to publish those official ads. That will give you terms and terminology also. And of course, you're going to get used to the local various kinds of columns done by local writers, people who wrote the gossip columns for Silver City, or they wrote the gossip column for Helena, social notes, or you might even look in that gossip column on Sunday to see how certain different kinds of your community organizations were written up. But again, always ask that librarian for useful search terms. Now, I want to also specify a word to you about OCR content. OCR is optical character recognition, and it has made a lot of full text searching possible if the print is legible and people have worked a little bit with it. But I'm going to caution you still, OCR does have an error factor. So do not assume that because you put in a descriptor that it in fact will come up every time. It depends on how it was scanned and how well it was scanned, and whether or not the software used had a really fine OCR feature. With some papers, that OCR error factor can be as high as 30%, depending on the quality of the source newspaper. I got that from an article in 2014. I reviewed the site at Morgan Smith, and they're still saying it's still that high. Errors can include, and you have to think of this because you say, why can't I find that particular thing? I should be able to find it. It can be just the image quality. It could be the type of font used in the original, the way in which they OCR'd the image and it kind of skewed a little bit, so it's not within its framework. It can be the text layout, ink smears, that's big, or somebody going through and checking and using a wax crayon paper across. Wax crayon papers will just really mess up that content, and sometimes that's the newspaper they had that got scanned or imaged. Hyphenated words come out funny. You have to think of not even just a hyphenated word, but what if your person that you want, John Cloudsmith. What if John appears on one line and his last name, Cloudsmith, appears on the next? Ouch. Sometimes the OCR is not built for that. It depends on what they use. What I'm telling you is all OCR is not the same. Paper porosity can also be a factor in terms of was it a good heavy paper? Was it good? Was it a good quality type of newspaper or print in the first place? So those can all cause problems for you. Here's what I do. Even if I've tried a particular term in quotation marks, like quotation mark, John Cloudsmith, quotation mark, and that doesn't come up, the first thing I do is I erase the name John so that just the last name, the surname, comes up if I am looking for a surname. That might help me. And I go through the total process again, making sure that that particular thing is used. I still retain that name, John Cloudsmith, in quotation marks, and I'll use it again on another day because sometimes papers, I think, are just plain being mean. They don't do the same job every day. I know it seems impossible, but that happens. I've already told you about a few of the big online sites like newspapers.com. We ought to be familiar with that. It does cost money. Your library may have it. Some of you may have it. Our particular Great Falls Genealogy Society library has it here on several of our computers, and we have people coming up and using it every day. We make, of course, our materials open to all of the public here. Chronicling America is free. You need to go out and read about this wonderful Library of Congress site so that you see what it really can do for you, but you'll also see its limitations. It's only gaining about 1 year right now. We know that everything pretty well is free behind 1923 if they've scanned it. But here's the deal. Not all states have participated in Chronicling America. Our look at newspapers is very uneven because some places got started with scanning their newspapers quite some time before the Chronicling America thing, so you won't find it. Maybe you'll find the dude from New York at the postcard site who has just been scanning all the newspapers in New York that he can find for free, and he's got way more at his site for New York than all of Chronicling America has for everything. So don't assume that it's always there. You have to go out and look at all the newspapers that are free. I'll show you that in a little while. There's a thing called Google newspapers and their Google books. We'll talk about that. I really like Genealogy Bank because it splits things out in your search a little differently. It will show you how many people are available that have obituaries by that name. It will show you the books that are available out at the Library of Congress. It will show you various factors. So it's a good one to use, even though it does cost dollars. Newspaper Archive is there, of course. It gets covered in many ways across these. And I should tell you that any of these, Ancestry or newspapers.com or Newspaper Archive or Genealogy Bank, they all take advantage of the fact that they can get all of the same print from Chronicling America absolutely free. They are entitled to it at their site. So if you're getting charged and it's before 1923, go have a look at Chronicling America first. And then, of course, the Memory Project sites it states, or Texas, for example, has its own large site. California has its own large site. Washington does. So go out and sample because they're changing all of the time. Again, I've left these for you on my Montana newspapers availability site, telling you how many things are free. Montana Newspapers homepage, for example, they give you scans for more than 140 newspapers. It's really a great site. So there are various things for you here. You'll see things like the digital archives of the Haverhill County Library. They've gone out, put their things together, but you have to look very carefully for it just at their site. It's not generally advertised elsewhere. So that's a sampling again. You're going to say, but Jan, I know a whole bunch more, and I hope you show me what you have. Google newspapers are available. You're going to need to strategize as you use the search capabilities here, because they have multiple uses. Their newspapers do. Google considers news over 30 days old to be historic. Now, they got themselves into a little bit of trouble, not trouble, but they just said, yeah, we're not going to do any more newspapers for a while till everything is settled in the courts, and it's been a few years. Their material has been OCR'd. Sometimes with some of those newspapers, because they got some that were really old and the content was kind of faint on some pages, that you may have more success with browsing. Make sure you have the correct title for the newspaper, so go out and look at them carefully. They do have some neat features, and it's very easy to use. Again, they're located out at news.google.com, and it's all free. They've made sure of that. By the way, they have another site called books.google.com. They have more than 10 million free books available for you, printed prior to 1923, and now they're going beyond that to, I think, about 1925 or 1926. They got, everybody got into a large, unexpected suit from Disney Company over things that they did not want to let go the copyright of. So you can go out and look for the story on that at Wikipedia. Well, this is what the first page of Google newspapers looks like. So you'll see that there are papers, of course, from various countries, not just the United States. So keep that in mind. Chronicling America, I've told you about. It's free. Library of Congress dedicated to preserving, making old newspapers available. When I did this particular slide, it said before 1924. I do think it's beyond that. There are some steps you have to utilize carefully there. Don't be impatient. It's a tiny bit clunky. So you go out to all digitized newspapers and select the state you want. Then for that state, select the particular newspaper. All the newspapers will come up. Browse next to see what the edition contains before you really get into using your various kinds of descriptors. It pays dividends for you. Frankly, I find things at Elefind or Elephant and Google site easier in many instances. But Chronicling America is a good site, and Montana has participated in it probably about 4 times. So we've been able to get quite a bit of our newspapers done. This is what it looks like when it comes up. It does have another thing over at the right here at the top, use the U.S. newspaper directory. Remember, I told you when I was looking at the original source book for newspapers in the United States, I liked using that one better because it also had Canada. Remember, you have lots of states in the United States, Washington, Montana, Idaho, Minnesota, and so on, who have U.S. newspapers right directly across the border from Canadian newspapers. And guess what? Sometimes the Canadian newspapers did a better job of the gossip. So you want to pay attention to that. But that's what this site looks like right now. I pulled this one up and it says that there's over 20 million pages available there. So it's well worth your time. Other large databases with historical newspapers, Elefind or Elephant, it's the world's largest, over 200 million items from more than 4,000 newspaper titles. And I always start by browsing out there, looking at the latest dates. You're going to find big U.S. collections, various things. So it's kind of nice. Again, realize there isn't any one of these that is better than any other. You need to curate a list for yourself. If you're going to go in and you're going to look, for instance, at Colorado, You need to curate a list for what's best for that area of Colorado. And you can do that by looking at these various sites. One of the first things I'd do is I would go to Colorado newspapers out at Family Search and look in their particular descriptors to be able to find that. And you might be able to find just a bunch of newspapers. It will give you a fair idea of what is going on. But I've found it doesn't always have the latest information. So I'm giving you 8 big sources here so you can look across them to at least get started. This is what it looks like. It's very, very simple to utilize. I've loved it for some of the things I could find that popped up. Maybe there was an article in Sydney, Australia that featured something from Great Falls, Montana, and I would have never caught that funny article at all. But they did because of the time period. The advantages, again, it's a nice overview. There's lots of free materials. They'll tell you a few of the paid sites, but it just covers commercial sites. It does all kinds of things. I love the ads that come up at that particular site because maybe they're advertising selling a ranch in Montana. I've found that. Maybe it's advertising an estate sale. It's a pretty nice site. I'd spend at least a half hour there just for yourself, just to explore. Of course, there's states with stellar free resources that are outstanding. I've just named some of them here. Texas has a great site that I know of. Alaska is beginning with their site. California, Colorado, Wyoming has got some pretty nice. Again, it all depends also on who decided to share what in those states. Sometimes when I go to Nebraska and I need information from Weeping Water in Cass County, I still have to go to that historical society and probably depend still, if I want some of the newspapers that are not in Lincoln, Nebraska, I still have to go look for some that have not been digitized yet. Is it worth your effort? It sure is. Out at Elfind one day from the Madera Tribune in Madera, California. This was 18 February 1943. I'm going to read this to you because I don't think you can see it very well, but I found this. Reporters embarrassed by mistake of girl, Great Falls, Montana, February 18. Newspaper men aren't the cynical, biased, and blasé characters the movies would have you believe. When a young woman entered the city room of the Great Falls Tribune and took off all of her clothing, the reporters were startled and even embarrassed. Blushing like schoolboys, they called the police. The girl said she had mistaken the Tribune building for her hotel. She was hauled in. So you'll find things like that. How would I've been able, I couldn't describe that as a funny story in the Tribune. That would not have worked. But by going out to that international site that grabbed things off front page newspapers, I was able to find that again. So it really is worth your time. Well, of course, there's the paid site, Find My Past, which has all of the United Kingdom, including Scotland. And they post new pages and new newspapers each Friday morning. Now, you can go out to that site and look for free at any time to see what they have. But go out on Friday morning because they're another site that's really putting up lots of things. I have found things about one of my sister-in-law's families, the Gillinghams, who came from England in the 1880s and still found them. The only place I would have found the articles were in Find My Past because the local newspaper explained that they'd been home for a visit. Isn't that a cool thing? My Heritage does papers from across the world. It's best found while you're searching for a topic or a person. You have to pay money again, but it's worth it. There are things like the United Kingdom newspaper archives, cost money, Canada newspaper archives. You need to go out and look, and they are constantly rebranding themselves. United Kingdom Newspaper Archives also has a double brand right now that's called British Newspaper Archives. So be aware of that. It does cost money. Canadian newspaper archives. It's well worth looking in these, especially if you had people who were in Canada, or you have people who lived close to the border, like places in Montana up near the top of the border, because guess what? Right across the border, those newspapers reported the gossip. They had gossip columns from the US side. So you want to look at those. It's well worth it. And Canada is really getting with their program now and doing much more with Canadian newspapers. There's a thing called the Newspaper Archive. I find, you can look at some free archival collections. You can also get an account for which you'll pay. Yes, it has a large collection, but in some places it's pretty spotty for me. I haven't used it as much because my family just didn't. Newspapers.com it has over 22,750 newspapers. I'm getting a little interference right now from the downstairs. Okay, it stopped. I had a little interference from the downstairs library. They had an unexpected announcement. So anyway, newspapers.com has over 22,000 newspapers, keeps getting more all the time. Remember, I told you that the Great Falls Leader is sooner than later, we hope, going to be in this. And it is super easy to search. I would advise you to look at the clipping carefully. I will tell you that if you clip using their clipper, you need to be aware of the fact that they're going to, in fact, use you or use your name as an ad. Bless their little buttons. And so I do something a little unusual. I just go out and grab a piece of paper from Word, a blank piece of paper. I cut and paste onto that piece of paper, and then I find that they don't use me for their ad. So it's up to you. It's kind of clunky if you're using newspapers.com and you use their clipper. Pretty soon you find you're going to have to clean out what they're doing, because every time you bring up a newspaper, it's kind of annoying if somebody else has clipped that particular thing or clipped one right beside it. You'll get the little ad saying you know such and such, or this particular person clipped this one too. Now, if you like that, that's great. I don't like it, especially when I'm attempting to clip articles for various people, clients in our library, or even for me. But it's pretty simple. And they also have a newspaper blog called The Fish Wrap, which can kind of be fun sometimes if you look at it on Friday morning. And that's free to sign up for if you like blogs and you're looking at it. It will give you news of what's coming up. So that's a neat place to go look at just every once in a while. I go look at it about once a month. Genealogy Bank, of course, is just one of my favorites because they have a list of newspapers by state, and each and every month they tell you all the new ones that are coming in. You can get their free newsletter, but you don't really need it to find out what is happening and what's coming in from each state. You can just pull up this particular page, and I pulled it up again today just to make sure it was there. You can go and you can see what's there in Idaho or Montana or Ohio or District of Columbia or whatever. I do like a piece of information that they've got for you on how to find your ancestors in newspapers. They tell you they built theirs through OCR, and there are some important points. Newspapers don't always include the full first name. They could be listed under an initial. So you've got to try all of those variations. For goodness sakes, please do not, in your search term, put in a person's full name, like first, middle, and last. And do try their nicknames. You never know. Don't limit your search to just one newspaper. I mean, I'm well aware in both North Dakota, Minnesota, and Montana, I have relatives who live right up on the high line of those states. And so I'm always going to be looking and trying to grab things in that Canadian newspaper or even the other newspapers. It's surprising to see that, for instance, the Great Falls Tribune had columns for over 40 different communities in the 1930s. And that's not surprising because they were connected to those communities by the railroad. So people came in to look. You'll find in Billings, you'll find something similar. In Bozeman, in Missoula, and so on, you'll find similar. You have to look at that for each state and say, where did that railroad go in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s? Because at that point, that was still a prime way to get newspapers from those coming straight off the train stop. Yeah, the local newspaper reporter could go down, see who had just come in from Choteau, Montana, or who had just come in from someplace in the West, like Seattle, and make a whole list and have the particular thing for the Falls gossip line ready for the day. Look for a nearby bigger city newspaper like Lewistown, if you're out there in the hinterlands, or Billings, if you're out, your people were out in the hinterlands. And don't limit your search to direct ancestors. Search for your cousins, your siblings, search for people that you know went with them. These are all really fine ideas. At Ancestry, yes, they have some newspapers. Now, let me explain the relationship of Ancestry to newspapers.com. Prior to the time that they purchased newspapers.com, they were already putting some of the newspapers into Ancestry as a whole. So those are the ones that you're going to find down here. And anymore, in order to get to those, you have to go beyond the first screen, scroll down on the right side, find the card catalog, hit newspapers and periodicals. And then you can filter it by location and date or by title and keyword. So you'll find a few of the newspapers there. Newspapers.com is an independent business that they now own. And if you're going to utilize that, in my opinion, you need to use the full Premier edition. That's where you'll get the very best. Otherwise, if you get the one that goes with Ancestry, sometimes you'll get right to the really hot thing that you wanted to find, and they'll say, not available unless you pay more. That's Ancestry. So you can find newspapers and search them by location or date till you get what you want. And yes, they have stuff from various places. They're saying here that they had one Australian newspaper there at that point in the 1600 to 1699s and so on. So you can get a list of newspapers to pop up telling you of the number of pages that they have available. For example, for Montana, this one, Ancestry, is really the better site. The newspapers.com is not nearly as good. It doesn't have very much of the daily interlake for Kalispell, Montana. So again, there isn't any one site that is the best. This is what the Montana list of newspapers looks like for some of the papers anyway. I just took kind of the midpoint early this morning and plopped it in. So they've got the Billings Gazette, 466,000 pages. They've got the Standard Post from Butte, Anaconda, the Herald from Billings, and so on. And you'll notice the Daily Interlake down there, 168,000 pages. And they'll also have things like the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, just one page. You'll find the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, however, out at newspapers.com. But you're going to be able to find various kinds of source information. And when you've got that source information for the newspaper, take time to copy, paste that source information. So, of course, you've got it to put into your sources for your genealogy, and you're getting the right date and so on. The Montana Memory Project, also known as the Montana Newspapers, is free. It's montananewspapers.org. And right now, it's really key for you, because if you were thinking that you were going to go into the Montana Historical Society building in Helena, it's closed for 2 years. They're busy packing and moving and figuring out where all of their things are going to be 2 years from now when they open the new museum. So it's really nice that Montana newspapers are available to you. And of course, in the Montana Memory Project, you've got way more than the newspapers. So if you haven't been out there and looked, here's what I advise you to do. You might say, Jan, I don't have anybody in Montana, so why would I look there? I want you to look there so that you get familiar with the flavor of a memory project as it exists in other states. Then go find that other state or that other museum or that other archive so that you can look for those newspapers. It's a very important thing for you to do. Just spend 10, 15 minutes and you'll get an idea of all the things that they've been told that they can utilize. The memory projects across the United States received federal money from the Library of Congress to be able to do these projects. So when you look at one, you're potentially looking at the way in which some others might be organized. Of course, any of these could have way more than just newspapers or just look at things in a certain way. You can Google the Montana Memory Project if you can't remember, montananewspapers.com. Out at our site here in our patron computers in our Great Falls Genealogy Library, you're going to be able to see number 1 and number 2 computers. They have my list of all my newspapers available in Montana. It's very complete. I'm updating it again right now. I've only found 2 new newspapers so far this year, and I'm tickled pink to see that they're in there. They are newspapers north of us, and it looks like our newspapers there are getting covered better and better each day. So we have the Conrad newspaper, and we can go out and look at those daily columns, or those weekly columns, pardon me, that show various communities in the vicinity of Conrad, and even in other places where they've picked up things about family. Here's what Montana Newspapers looks like. It's very easy to use. You can browse it by title. I always browse by location because I want to see what's there on the map. I can browse by date. I can look at all the cities once I have delimited by location in that area or delimited by title or by date, and I can search, and I can also do an advanced search. It's a pretty neat place to be. They've done a great job. Here's some of the things that they'll show you that are there. The Big Timber Pioneer newspaper, the Fallon County newspapers, the Fort Peck Reservation newspapers, the Billings Student, MSU Billings newspapers, high school newspapers, all kinds of things you wouldn't expect. Now, why would you want to look at high school newspapers for the period? You want to, if you can, look at those high school newspapers because frequently they actually went out into the community and did the news from there. You will find that sometimes. And in fact, today, one of the happiest stories right now is Belt, Montana does not happen to have a newspaper. And so they rely on the Tribune. Or they rely on the Cascade Courier. But I can tell you there's a group of students in the journalism classes at Belt High School that go out every 2 weeks and do the news for the town. Now, isn't that just the neatest thing that is happening? I think of it as something that's very good. So they are actually doing news from the Senior Citizen Center and so on, and getting a little bit of that community news in there that would otherwise be missed. So I'm going to invite you right now, of course, all of you to come to our Great Falls Genealogy Society library and use our resources and the talents of our Great Falls librarians. I know that Helena is also doing some other fantastic work that I just heard about this morning, and they're doing newspapers this week. So you might want to contact them and see if you can find out even more about newspapers, because we do make them available for you. And let me see, that's the end of that particular thing. So I'm going to get out of that. And I'm going to stop the screen sharing, and I'm going to take a look at chat and see if you have questions.